The first time I saw paintings by Francis Bacon was in 1946. They moved me to write about him with great excitement, and they had the same effect on quite a lot of other writers, some of whom were excitedly in favor, and some excitedly against. 40 years later, the excitement and controversy about Bacon are still as intense as they were then. The point is that his work touches a nerve. People feel that it's making a powerful statement in regard to the human situation. And the question is whether it's an inflated and perverse statement or a direct and acute one. What's certain is that Bacon is a very direct and acute man. He's a man, too, of remarkable independence of spirit and energy and ruthlessness, especially ruthlessness with himself. I met him in 1949 and have seen a great deal of him ever since, and we've talked endlessly about his work and about the way he works. And they go on being mysterious. When you started showing, I think your work attracted an enormous amount of attention, which was a very ambivalent kind, and I think the ambivalence was expressed most clearly in something written by that great Bloomsbury voice, Raymond Mortimer. Ah, if only Mr. Bacon would paint us a rose. In other words, you were a wonderful painter, but why did you have to have all that morbid subject matter? I think that was the attitude. I don't even know that the attitude has changed all that much in the intervening 35 years or so.
But then if you think about, I mean, if we take that up about why doesn't he paint a rose? A rose also is very mortal. When you see a rose, this beautiful rose, that in a day or two is dying, its head is falling over, and it's withered. So is there a great deal of difference between a rose and my subject matter, really? It's just a difference of, it's only a difference of subject matter. I don't know why they always think that I take horrifying subjects. I don't think there's anything horrifying about my subjects. I think if you are able to give over as directly as you possibly can the excitement of life, they have labeled that as being a horrific side.
I don't know whether it's even that they just think you take horrifying subjects, but they think that when you take neutral subjects like a man sitting on a chair, or very agreeable subjects like people making love, that somehow there's an element of morbidity or gruesomeness or something like that.
Well, it's certainly something I don't try to put into my work at all. I try to make it as what is as intensely real as I can for myself. And in doing that, I may bring in very strongly this quality of mortality. Because the more violently, more strongly you feel about life, the more strongly you must be aware of death. I'm very influenced by the atmosphere of a room, do you know? And I just knew from the very moment that I came here that I would be able to work here. I stayed here for the last 22 years. If we can go back 22 years, I can't remember when that means. 61, I think, 1961. I mean, I don't know how one can explain the atmosphere of places. I suppose it's the form of construction.
When you first saw it, was it the light that particularly made you like it? Were you aware of what particular things made you like it?
No, because I had the ceiling taken off this place. And I had this light which is not the ideal light because it's east-west, so it's not an ideal light, but it just had an atmosphere that I knew I could work here. I bought a beautiful studio around the corner, and I made it too grand. It was so grand. It was carpeted with beautiful curtains, and it was the most perfect light and everything, but I still couldn't do a thing in it. I was absolutely castrated in the place. I couldn't do a thing.
But this is somewhere where you actually must have painted the majority of your surviving works, given that you don't destroy as much as you used to.
I think I have painted a great number of them here, yes. And that is the reason that I'm always hoping, until I drop dead, that I won't have to give it up. But that's things one doesn't know.
It can't be usual for people to do very large figurative paintings as you do. And as figurative paintings, they are large. So this means that you must have a very clear idea in your head of exactly where the figure or figures are going to be located on the canvas.
Well, yes, it is clear. But as we said before, it develops in the working. And I don't make preliminary sketches. I do sketch out very roughly with a brush sometimes, a vague outline of something. And my preconceived idea of it is not very exact. It's a generalized idea of what I'm going to do, and the idea develops in the working.
Now, when you say a general idea, you once said to me something about you can daydream and see all sorts of paintings that you want to do, that they just fall in like slides. And I've actually always wondered how precise, how crystallized those ideas were before you began at all.
They're not very crystallized, but they're a general, as it were, they're a general idea of what I want to do. And it's perfectly true that they do very often, if I daydream, they do fall in like slides, but nevertheless the slides are not given to you in very great detail. There's a general impression of what you want to do.
But, for example, a figure lying on a bed, or two figures making love, or...
Well, exactly. But those things, then they develop in the working. Both they become more defined, and sometimes it's a complete transformation. That is where what comes in with what we've often talked about in these things, about the element of chance or accident or whatever you like to call it. Those things enter in only after you've started working.
And you find that photographs make suggestions that are helpful, or what?
You see, I use photographs rather than in the way that people use models or subject matter, or whatever way you like to put it, because I do, in fact, find photographs much less inhibiting than having the subject sitting there before me. It's true to say that in portraits that I've done, I've only done portraits of people that I know already very well and have seen them a great deal, but I still have photographs of them which I am able to, as it were, refer to again, just to jog my memory as to how they looked.
Is part of the excitement of painting people for you the sense of being close to caricature and the risks that involves?
I wouldn't say it's the excitement, but I think that if you are able to really bring over the intensity of somebody's appearance, you very often are drifting on the edge of caricature. And I think this is one of the reasons that that most people go to the most academic painters when they want to have their portraits made, because for some reason they prefer a sort of coloured photograph of themselves instead of thinking of having themselves really trapped and caught.
When you're doing a portrait, are you in fact conscious of trying to convey qualities of personality of the particular person?
No, because I think the qualities of the personality, the qualities of a person come in their appearance. I can't make a portrait of somebody's soul or their psyche or whatever you like to call it. I can only make a thing of their appearance. But I think that their appearance is deeply linked with their behavior. I think when I'm looking at you, I see you there. But it isn't, I can't just explain what you are. I see you there. And you could be photographed, but then after you'd been photographed, one still wouldn't know what your realism was. You'd have to find a technique by which you can give over all the pulsations of a realism of a person.
No, not at all.
Well, I don't know how that's done.
The pulsations.
Yes.
Giacometti used to say that for him, the difference between a live being and a skull was the gaze. And that is what he was trying to trap, was the gaze. He, in other words, was able to define what it was that was the pulsation. Can you find that you can?
But I think what Giacometti says is in fact a very limited way of putting it. I don't think it's just the gaze, after all. You're conscious of the whole structure of a person. I mean, one knows, Giacometti is quite right, that a skull is more abstract because it hasn't got eyes. But then you've got your nose, your mouth, your teeth, your tongue, your everything, your lips. You've got all those things too. So he's limiting it very much when he said it's just the gaze. I mean, I know that now with all the mechanical aids, with the cinema, with the film and everything else, how are you going to trap reality? How are you going to trap appearance without making an illustration of it? And that is one of the great fights and one of the great excitements of being a figurative artist today. And so I think a painter, if he's going to attempt to record life, he's got to do it in a much, much more intense and curtailed way. It has to have the intensity of a very, you may say, you can call it sophisticated simplicity. I mean, you have to abbreviate it into intensity. Because with all the other ways of doing it, there's no point in just making an illustration of somebody.
But you don't just abbreviate. You also impose a certain rhythm, a distortion, some might say. Why does one have to distort as freely as modern artists like yourself do distort?
Well, I think of it as, again, as realism, because after all, what makes a portrait, a great portrait, is what one can call the realism of the image, which no matter how how deformed it may be, or how altered it may be, it returns you to the person that you're trying to catch. I mean, we're talking about something very, very difficult. We're talking about the extreme points of realism. But in a way, it's only the extreme points that are interesting. And as the techniques of the cinema and of all forms of recording have become better and better, so from the point of view of the painter, it's made it more exciting, but yet in a way more contained, or the painter has to be more inventive to be able to put over the realism. He has to reinvent realism. He has to wash himself back. He has to wash himself. He has to wash the He has to really wash the realism back onto the nervous system by his invention. Because there isn't such a thing in painting any longer as natural realism. It has to be reinvented.
When you work, you start in the morning.
I like starting very early. Yes, I find everything comes to me more easily early in the morning than later. I know many artists don't start till about noon, and then go on through the afternoon and into the night. But I find early in the morning works much better for me generally.
Yes.
If it works at all.
You said that when you're doing a portrait, you prefer to work from photographs and from memory rather than have the subject in the room. So I suppose if that's the case, then you really don't like having people around while you're working.
No, I don't. As a matter of fact, I don't really like having people around, but because I feel I'm much freer if I'm on my own. But I'm sure there are a lot of painters who would perhaps be even more inventive if they had people around them. But it doesn't happen in my case. I find that if I'm on my own, I can allow, in a way, the paint to dictate to me, rather than having people around who I'm conscious of. So the images that I'm making, the things I'm putting down on the canvas, dictates the thing to me, and it gradually builds up and comes along. That's the reason I like being alone. Left with my own despair of being able to do anything at all on the canvas.
You talked a great deal in the past. I think you do so little less now, but you still talk about it, the role of chance and accident in the evolution of the paint on the canvas. Where does it principally operate?
It can operate anywhere. It can operate in the way that you put the paint on. Suddenly, the way you put the paint on suddenly suggests another form. You know, I use rather large brushes working on canvas, even for small paintings, and you find that the mark that you make suggests another mark from which you can develop. So it's like that. And sometimes when I've been working, I've been so disgusted with the thing, I'm so sick of it, that I just take the brush and put brush marks all over it, thinking, oh, fuck this thing, I can't, it's not going to work at all. And then suddenly, out of this chaos, comes the possibility of making an image I hadn't thought of before. For instance, that painting in the Museum of Modern Art, I first tried to do. I think I tried to do a gorilla in a cornfield. Then I tried to do a bird alighting, and then gradually all the marks I'd made suggested this other image, which is a totally accidental image.
But why an accidental image?
I'd never thought of doing an image like that ever in my life.
An image
before.
that came from the unconscious, but is that an accidental image?
Well, if you explain to me what the unconscious is, we'll say it's not accident.
Is a dream image an accidental image?
I couldn't tell you. I have to ask Freud. I thought you want to ask me about my youth, about my childhood, really.
Yeah.
Well, I was born in the thing. My father was a trainer of racehorses, and he was not Irish, but I was born in Dublin. Neither my mother or father were Irish, but nevertheless, I was born in Dublin, and I was brought up till the beginning of the First World War in Kildare. And then my father went into the War Office here, and so we came to live in London for a time. And then, until about the age of 16, I gravitated between England and Ireland. And the first house that I lived in was not very far from the Curragh. And afterwards, I lived in what used to be then known as Abbeyleix, but is now known as Leith. And we lived in a beautiful house there called Farmley. And you've asked me sometimes why a lot of my the painting, at the back of my paintings are curved. And I think it is perhaps because the rooms at the back of the house were all curved. And perhaps that has had an influence. Maybe one of the reasons, in the triptychs especially, the backgrounds are curved. It may have had something to do with that. Then, when I was about 16, I left Ireland, and my mother, who came from Firth Steel, and she had a little money in those days. She had a little money, and she made me an allowance of £3 a week. In those days, you could exist on £3 a week. And I went to Berlin. I wasn't in Berlin very long, but I did see Berlin about 1927-28, which was one of the, what's called the great decadent years, they say, of Berlin. And I do remember when I first went to Berlin, I went with somebody who had picked me up, whatever you like to say, and we went and stayed at the Adlon Hotel, which are now, I think, is on the east side, on the other side of the wall, which is the most wonderful hotel. Because I always remember them wheeling the breakfast in the morning with these wonderful trolleys with the with the enormous swans' necks coming out of the four corners of the thing, which I've always remember. And then the nightlife of Berlin at that time was very exciting for me, coming almost straight from Ireland. And to go down the Kurfürstendamm and that kind of thing was really very exciting in those times, because I'd never seen anything from coming from a very puritanical country in a way like Ireland, going to a city which at that time was wide open was very exciting for me. Mind you, at that age you don't take all those things, you're just astonished by what's going on around you. I then went to Paris, and I stayed for a short time in Paris, and it was about that time that at Rosenberg's, I saw an exhibition of Picasso. And I think at that moment I thought, well, I will try and paint too. Well, that was about I think it was about 1928. Then I tried to paint for a long, long time, and practically nothing. And you know, I didn't really start to paint till I had long periods when I had small jobs and things in between. But then, when the war started, I was turned down from the army because I was an asthmatic. So then I was on my own, and it was then that I really started to paint, about 1943, 44. And it was those things that, when at Lefebvre, we had that first exhibition with Henry Moore, Graham Sutherland, and I had some things, and there were other people, And it was then that I showed those three studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, which people were very, very violently against those things. And I always remember one of the usual bitchy critics to me said, why bother to do things like that when it's already been done by Picasso? But I do in fact feel that they're slightly different, although they were influenced, very influenced by Picasso. I think they have a slightly different implication. How can I go on now? What more have I got to say?
And what did your parents think about your wanting to paint?
Well, it was my relationship with my father and mother was never good. We never got on. My father, I mean, the very thought that I might want to be an artist were absolutely, well, they were horrified at it because they thought I'd have to earn my living, and they thought, well, you'll never earn your living as an artist. There's no possible chance of it. So they were totally against it.
What kind of education did you have?
Well, I went for a short time to a place called Dean Close in Cheltenham, and it was a kind of minor public school, and I didn't like it, and I was continuously running away. So in the end, they took me away. I was only there about a year. So I had a very limited education. I mean, I am fairly self-educated because I never in those days, I wanted to enjoy myself. When you're young, you want to enjoy yourself.
Going back to your paintings, do you think they have any relationship to Surrealist painting? Because there's a kind of ambiguity in the forms often, which make me think that they do.
I'm not really very fond of the Surrealist painters. They don't really mean anything to me. But nevertheless, I do know that Surrealism had a great influence. But then, of course, Surrealism threw one back to Freud and threw one back to things, very many things of the past. It threw me back to all kinds of things. You could say it threw me back, threw you back in a sense to Shakespeare and to Aeschylus. After all, there's nothing more surrealist than both Aeschylus and Shakespeare. So, as a movement, it was very interesting, but I've never been very interested in the painting it has produced, the Surrealist movement. I remember once talking to Michel Leiris about this thing and about Picasso, and he said, as he was a great friend of Picasso's, and I said to him, but he said to me, you realize that Picasso was never Surrealist. But then I always think that Picasso was the man who absorbed everything, and he absorbed Surrealism too.
There's a phrase you used to me once in talking about Picasso and why you admired Picasso. And you talked about Picasso's having the brutality of fact in his work, which struck me as a marvelous definition of realism. And I thought it said a lot about you and what you wanted to do.
Well, of course, we were talking then, I think you brought up the question of Matisse. And I said to you, I believe, for me, I much prefer Picasso because he has the brutality of fact compared to Matisse. But after all, if one uses the word brutality, I mean, in one sense, life in its raw is an extremely brutal thing, and Picasso is able very often to bring over the rawness of life at a very acute point. And when I talked about the brutality of fact in Picasso, Picasso, in a curious way, was able to put it across more directly and with less expressionism in it. It seemed to be the fact itself without the will to express it.
You don't think as you work about expressing the brutality?
No, I don't at all.
You
I try to express what is there. Not, I don't think, otherwise I would be completely an expressionist.
We were speaking of painters you've been especially interested in. Can you say what it is above all that's drawn you to Velázquez?
Of the general influence of Velázquez is extremely difficult to analyze. I would say it was the tone or atmosphere of his work, the fastidiousness, in a way, of his work. Because I think that Velázquez probably was perhaps one of the most fastidious painters, because he not only had this wonderful sense of color, but was also kept within a remarkable, he had a remarkable control of imagery too. I think that the portrait that Velázquez did of the Pope, of Innocent X, I think of it not only as a very great portrait, but one of the greatest paintings in the world. And like a great number of people, I was tremendously haunted and fascinated by it. And I think that that is one of the reasons I used that image, but I very often now regret that I ever used it, because after all it had already been done, and it's been done so perfectly you couldn't do it again.
Do you feel you were taking something from something that was not already fully developed as an image and complete when you drew more on the drawings, as you've said that you do from Michelangelo?
Well, this is the thing with the drawings of Michelangelo. I think what they have certainly done for me is to give me a sense of the possibilities of volume within the human body. And I think that is the thing that I've learned most from the Michelangelos, this wonderful sense of volume that he had. And I think perhaps because they're not completely finished in the drawings, that they're more suggestive, and that is one of the reasons that they've always been a very, very strong, a marvelous thing to use for me from a formal point of view. I mean, I've used Muybridge, for instance, very often. It's a very interesting work, and the images were tremendously suggestive to me of ways I could use the human body. There is a painting I did of wrestlers, which comes out of Muybridge. I put these wrestlers on a bed. So, of course, well, it's been called everything. It's been called the buggers. It's been called everything, because I presumably, by putting it onto a bed rather than just leaving it on the ground, they thought it was more sexual. Why people shouldn't be just as sexual on the ground as on the bed would be hard to explain. But some people seem to think that the act of sex only takes place in a bed.
In using Muybridge, you've been able to take models that had the advantage of not being among the world's great works of art, like the Innocent X or like the Venus of Urbino.
That is perfectly true. They haven't got that wonderfully developed form or developed imagery that you get in the paintings that you're talking about. I mean, I'm influenced by anything. I can be influenced by a news photograph or some photograph that I find in any kind of magazine as much as I can be influenced by Velázquez. Doesn't really much matter. For some reason, certain things bring up these images for you. many years ago, I happened to find a book in Paris on diseases of the mouth. And the colours were so beautiful that interested me, and I think that that's very often the reason I did the Scream. But sometimes now I do go into medical shops and buy books on, on skin diseases. Not that I'm really able to use them directly, but sometimes the colours are so beautiful that they suggest other ways of using colour on the skin. Oh, come in, John. I'm glad you came down. John is David is just asking me the most difficult question of what he thinks are the essential things that an artist needs. I think one of the things is that you have to know from prehistoric times right up to today the history of art. I think then you have to, if you're going to decide to be a painter, then I think you've got to decide that you're not going to care if you make a real fool of yourself. Not to be afraid of making a fool of yourself. And then I think another thing is to be able to find subject matters which are really absorb you, to try and do, or to use, or however you like to put it. You see, I know that I've looked at everything, but I've looked also a great deal at at the cinema. And I was certainly, when I was much younger, was very influenced by the films of Eisenstein, especially by a very earlier film of his called Strike, and also the Battleship Potemkin. And as you know, I've quite often used the Screaming Nurse. Unfortunately, I fear never as well as it was used by Eisenstein in the film. Perhaps this is one of the things that's better done in the cinema. Well then, after that, I have been very influenced by the films of Buñuel, especially Le Chien Andalou and also the L'Âge d'Or, because I think that Buñuel had, in the same way as Eisenstein had, a remarkable precision of imagery. I can't say how they've directly affected me, but they certainly have affected my whole attitude to visual things. In the acuteness of the visual image that you've got to make.
How many paintings has Francis done of you so far, John?
Well, he's done two of me, a triptych and one big one.
Well, a triptych of heads.
Of heads, yeah.
Yeah, and then
and one large one, me standing up by a canvas, which I like very much.
Were those? You use photographs in doing this?
Well, I do, but as I know John very well and have looked at his face a great deal, therefore I was able to do them as I usually do with portraits, as we were talking yesterday about this thing, that I generally do it rather if I know the person very well, I do it from photographs rather than from having the person there, because I find I'm less inhibited. Because you see, I've known John, and I very much like his looks, and it's always nicer to do portraits of people whose looks you really like.
You have actually had relatively few subjects, haven't you? There's been Isabel Rawsthorne, Lucian Freud, Frank Auerbach, George Dyer, Peter Lacey,
Muriel Belcher.
The portrait of Frost of me, the triptych, my mother loves it. I don't think my father does so much. He thinks it's a bit dodgy.
Why do you think she loves it?
Because she thinks it looks like me. She can see me in it.
Is she used to looking at modern painting?
No, but she's used to looking at me, Dan.
Well, that's great.
I don't think your mother is a woman who has been particularly interested in painting.
Oh, she's not interested in painting at all, no.
But she just happens to like the portrait because she thinks it looks very much like
me, yes.
Like him. I wish you could have an old-fashioned corkscrew. Now they've made everything so new. It used to be much simpler when you just put the corkscrew in and pulled out the cork. Then now that you have to turn two things to get the cork out. Yes, well, it is opening at last, yes. Am I going to be the only one drinking?
When we go out to dinner and you say you choose something, and I, in order not to make it too extravagant, choose a very good second growth, you sort of grouch your way through the first bottle and then say, let's have something proper now, and order Latour or Lafite.
I see. Oh, well, I don't know.
I think you're actually as difficult to please over wine as you are over painting. You don't like much of your own, you don't like much of anybody else's, and you only like the very, very best.
Let's agree to that then.
Don't you, when you're out with Francis, constantly feel slightly humiliated by the feeling that you're both eating the same thing, and you're quite enjoying it, and he suddenly says, "This is terrible." Does this happen to you?
Many a time, yeah. It's better than other places.
Well, I like the good food I was brought up with. I mean, my mother, living in Arnford, we used to have very, very simple, good but very simple food. Things like oxtail and shepherd's pie and all those kind of things which were absolutely delicious when they're properly cooked. They say wine doesn't make any difference. By accident, I was drunk, of course, and I made a marvellous stew, a very good thing, and I put a bottle of Petrus into it. As the Petrus was then £90 a bottle or something like that, mind you, it was only because I was well pissed that I put it in. But that's how it was a very good stew. Do you remember?
Very nice, yeah. You like the food, though, Dave, didn't you?
Yes, of course he does. Loves it.
There's more drink.
I'll have a little more, John. Have I got some? Give me a little.
Well, I don't know. Would you want wine?
Oh, did I? Yes, please. Thank you.
Is there any rhyme or reason in the pictures on the wall, or I mean, are they there very much by choice?
Yes, they are. There are some of the pictures, not all of them, which I've done recently, which I rather prefer, and then I like looking at them for this reason, that like other pictures and like other things I look at, they're always a kind of visual stimulus that I think, oh, well, why didn't I do this in another way or in a better way? And so they suggest all sorts of other images. So that's the reason I have them stuck up there. I have that portrait of Van Gogh because Van Gogh is one of my great heroes. And I think that in Van Gogh's work, you get something very remarkable, is that he was able to be almost literal, and yet he, by the technique and by the way he put up on the paint, he completely, although he gave you a marvelous vision of the image of the reality of things, he was able to do it without making an illustration of them. I saw it very clearly when I was once in Provence and going through that part of the Croix where he did some of his remarkable landscapes. And one just saw in this absolutely barren country that by the way he puts on the paint, he was just able to give it such an amazing living quality, which if he just made a simple illustration of it, he wouldn't have been able to do. And it's one of the things where you could say, we were talking before about painting and photography, is where a photograph could never have done what Van Gogh did in The Crow because of his actual technique, his way of putting on the paint, which brought it to life and gave you that reality of what The Crow has. It's this just plain bare land.
One of the things I see that you've got here is the painting of the sand dune.
Ah, yes. I know it's a painting that you like, and it's curious enough that lots of people say to me for some reason that they think it has to do with the human body. But I must say, I have never thought of it in that way. I just thought of it as a sand dune.
And you painted it with the dust from the studio, did you?
I painted with the dust from the studio. It is an awful game getting all that dust up from the floor, but there's plenty of dust next door, as you know, stuck to the pictures and everything else. So I just painted, took a cloth and painted and put it on like one would almost onto the wet paint, and then after it was dried, I set it as one sets a pastel. Because, you see, I haven't got it up here, but a painting that I have of a friend of mine, which is in the Tate Gallery, and his suit looks immaculate. And there's practically no paint on it at all, and it's paint with the dust from the floor. Well, as dust seems to be eternal, it seems to be the one thing that lasts forever. One of the things I noticed, and I was very pleased to see this, it seemed to be as fresh as when I first put it on, nearly 40 years ago.
Good Lord. Where did you find the dust? Let's go in.
Well, the dust I find, well, there's plenty of dust in this place. I mean, there's a mass of dust. Just see, in a few moments, you see the dust collects. I don't know if I've got a especially good example of it at the moment, of dust. Just collects anywhere. I just sweep it up if it hasn't collected. The only trouble is using the pastel, a lot of this dust has become coloured. But look at, you see? Now that is the perfect colour for a grey suit, isn't it? And that is what is all over his grey suit. And it hasn't altered the slightest bit after 40 years.
It's reasonably tidy at the moment, Francis, isn't it, really?
Well, this is tidy compared to what it
Last time.
sometimes is. John and I really tried to throw out things and tidy them a bit, because it just became that you could hardly walk into the place, do you know? It was like having a great dog in here that kept you out. There was so much of it in here. You see, most photographers love the walls here because I've used them as palettes. So, because they like the different colours and things that go onto the walls and onto the door. That's the reason I really will be very sad if I have to leave this place. I feel at home here in this chaos, because also chaos suggests images to me. Not necessarily just that I just love living in chaos. In any case, I can only be if I go into a new room, in a week's time the thing is in chaos.
Well, you're not a dirty person, just untidy, really.
I like things to be clean. I don't want my cups and things.
Oh, no.
I don't want the plates and things to be filthy dirty. But nevertheless, I would like it. I like a chaotic atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that I think it's easier to work in a chaotic atmosphere, and I'll tell you why I think it's easier. Because I think that art is a matter of bringing order to the chaos of life. And if you work in a room that is fairly chaotic, it makes sense in a chaotic room to be working towards making something ordered.
That I absolutely agree with you, but nobody could have put it better than you have put it. Because after all, what is art about is trying to make something out of the chaos of existence. Do you want to ask me about my politics? Well, if you want to ask them about it, I have always voted for people where I thought they would make the freedom that my life would be as free as possible. That's the only reason. I haven't got any very strong political feelings. I haven't got any political feelings at all. I just want the best kind of atmosphere in which to work. And so I have tended to vote to the right, I think because they're less idealistic than the left, and therefore one will be left freer. One won't be encumbered by the idealism of the left, so therefore I tended to vote always right, because I always feel that the right, for me, is the best of a bad job.
I've also felt about you that it wasn't just that because it suited you economically to vote right, but also that in a way the idealism of the left was in fact possibly morally questionable for you, because I really do think that you have a profound belief in the importance of chance, therefore the importance of injustice and unevenness as positive things, and that egalitarianism, which tends to rectify the way the cards are dealt, is actually, in a way, kind of abhorrent to you as a principle.
Well, it is, because I certainly don't believe in equality. Some people are born with greater gifts than others. Some people are born better looking than others. Certain women are born more beautiful than others. And they're going to have greater chances just for those very reasons. And so I have no belief in equality. I do believe in one thing, that people should, when it's possible, be given equal opportunity. But even when they're given equal opportunity, very few people will be able to avail themselves of it. So what can I say? This triptych I did from the Oresteia. Well, now, I don't know that I could talk about specific images that belong to the Oresteia, but it happens by reading it in translations, that it suggests an enormous number of images to me, and these are three of the images. I think of this one on the left as the Erinyes in their most vicious mood, which, like our guilt, haunts us. We're always haunted by our guilt, as you know. Well, they were well haunted by this image. Well, now, this is a painting that I did for the Guggenheim, and I particularly like the right-hand panel of this. I did feel that this, in a way, was influenced by the Cimabue crucifixion. It might be hard to identify it with that, but the Cimabue has always been a painting that I've admired enormously, because it always looked like an extraordinary image sliding down the cross. That is just water, tap running. And I think it's perhaps one of my better paintings, because I think of it as being a very immaculate painting with the tap flowing and the water flowing out, and that's all. It's an invention in which the paint, for a moment, for me, works. This is the painting of a landscape that I did. Well, I trampled it down to such an extent that that's about all that was left of the landscape. It was a photograph of a landscape, so I put in that bit. And it's but the colour doesn't reproduce at all well. But it's one of my favourite landscape, and that is one of I did of a torso. I didn't put the head on because I thought it would take away from the intensity of it. So I just put the cricket pads on. I didn't do it because I'm particularly interested in cricket. I did it because it made the image more real.
And you can't say why.
No.
Of course, they read things into things anyway. I mean, the example of the figure with the hypodermic syringe. Now, I suppose you might say in that particular case, it was a hypodermic syringe.
It was a hypodermic syringe. But I wanted something to nail the image, the figure, as it were, to the bed. And it looked more logical with a hypodermic syringe. I couldn't put a nail through their arm, so it was much easier to put a hypodermic syringe.
But it wasn't an attempt to suggest that the person was a drug addict.
Well, I wasn't really caring or thinking.
What is interesting is that it was a matter of indifference to you how this element was interpreted by people.
Well, the thing is, David, I only, when I started to paint, I never, for instance, expected anybody to ever buy my work. I always thought that I would have to do some other kind of job to earn my living. So that gradually, as I've been lucky enough to sell painting and have been able to live by my work, I think I still have the same indifference to what other people think about it. Because when I first started to work, I worked to excite myself. Now, as it happens, that other people become slightly interested in it. And so sometimes I sell things. My things are always difficult to sell, but every so often they do sell some.
Your ideas about life, about society and so forth, were they formed at an early time in your life, or did you go through periods when you thought quite other things?
Well, when I was young, I thought nothing except enjoying myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't really think about that. I suppose that later you could say my philosophy, you wouldn't call it a philosophy. I think life, in a way, is so difficult that you may as well be as decent as you possibly can be, or as indulgent as you possibly can towards other people, hoping they'll behave in the same way to you. It doesn't necessarily work out that way, but that's how it comes about. So, I mean, I haven't got a very coherent philosophy of life. But philosophy, what is it to me? Nothing, because after all, I'm from my own point of view. I know we're born and we die, and that's it. And you do something in between if you can, or if you want to.
It's often said about you that your work reflects a feeling of disgust about human beings and/or self-disgust.
Well, I don't really know. People, perhaps they feel that my work is full of mortality, but then we are. I mean, that is what life is. That's what life is. I mean, we are born, we exist for a moment, and we do with our life what we can, and then we die. And what else is there? And if somebody is very aware of that, perhaps it comes out in their work. I certainly don't try to press that side in my work at all. I think it's just very straightforward.